The war had gone on for far too long. Humanity's strongest warriors were gone, crushed under the weight of an enemy that had never known defeat. The Galactic Alliance, a council of powerful alien empires, had seen humans as nothing more than a nuisance, a species that had resisted longer than expected but was ultimately doomed to fall. Now Earth's defenses were shattered. The fleets were in ruins. The colonies had been abandoned. And the last army left standing wasn't an army at all. They were the forgotten ones. Scattered across the last remaining human outposts were those whom society had long since given up on. Dishonorably discharged soldiers, criminals who had been forced into service, failed cadets who never made it past training, rogue scientists who had been labeled too reckless to be trusted. These were the ones left to fight. No one had expected them to win. No one believed they could even hold the line. The Galactic Alliance had already declared victory, sending their elite forces to wipe out the last remnants of human resistance. Among them was Captain Elias Vance, a man who should have been a war hero. Instead, he had been court-martialed, thrown out of the Terran forces for disobeying orders. He had saved a colony once, but he had done it by defying the chain of command. And for that, he had been exiled. Now, the same government that had cast him aside had no choice but to rely on men like him. Beside him stood Sergeant Mira Kane, a woman who had once been a top strategist before she had been labeled a traitor. The official story was that she had leaked classified intelligence. The truth was more complicated. She had seen what was coming long before anyone else, had warned of an invasion that no one had believed would come. Now, as the war reached its final moments, she was exactly where she had always known she would be, on the battlefield, fighting an enemy no one else had prepared for. The others were just as broken. There was Rourke, a former engineer-turned-smuggler, whose modifications had saved more human ships than any official fleet designer. There was Dax, a cybernetic-enhanced warrior who had been deemed too unstable for service, but had survived battles that no one else had walked away from. And then there were the countless others, men and women who had been left behind, discarded, forgotten. The last human stronghold was a barren moon on the edge of known space. It had no strategic value. It wasn't even meant to be a battlefield. It was a scrapyard, a dumping ground for old war machines, broken ships, and outdated weapons. That was where they had been sent, left to rot. But now it was their last chance. The Galactic Alliance didn't even bother to send their full forces. Instead, they sent their elites, their most honored warriors, expecting to wipe out the last human resistance without much effort. After all, what could a group of misfits and criminals do against the finest warriors in the galaxy? The answer came in the form of fire. The first wave of alien forces landed with overwhelming numbers, moving in perfect formation, expecting a swift and easy victory. But the Underdogs had never played by the rules. They had no grand strategy, no structured formations. They fought like survivors, like people who had nothing left to lose. Mira had spent weeks studying the enemy, predicting their every move. She had learned how to break their patterns, how to disrupt their perfect strategies. Elias had trained them to fight in the shadows, to strike hard and disappear before the enemy even knew what had happened. Rourke had turned scrap metal into deadly traps, modifying old war machines into weapons no one had seen coming. The battle should have lasted minutes. It lasted hours, and then days. The Galactic Alliance watched in disbelief as their elites fell, one after another, unable to counter an enemy that refused to fight the way they expected. The forgotten soldiers were relentless, unpredictable, ruthless. For the first time in the war, the Alliance forces found themselves on the defensive, and for the first time, the Underdogs realized something no one else had believed. They weren't just surviving. They were winning. 2 seconds. You said, the galaxy had never seen anything like it. The elite forces of the Galactic Alliance, the best-trained warriors, the most advanced soldiers, the most feared conquerors, had landed on the barren moon, fully expecting to wipe out the last human resistance within hours. Yet, as the battle stretched on, As their forces were cut down in ways they had never experienced before, something terrifying began to take root in their ranks. Doubt. The humans they were fighting were not the disciplined soldiers of the Terran fleets, not the highly trained warriors that had been systematically eliminated over the course of the war. These were the rejects, the failures, the ones the Alliance had dismissed as insignificant. And yet, somehow, these were the humans who were standing against them, refusing to break, refusing to die, refusing to surrender. Captain Elias Vance moved through the wreckage of the battlefield like a ghost, his rifle slung across his back as he watched the enemy regroup. The first wave had been a disaster for them. The Underdogs had fought like scavengers, using the ruins of old war machines to create ambushes, turning abandoned structures into kill zones, every advantage the elites had counted on. Superior firepower, advanced tactics, technological supremacy had been twisted against them. Elias knew they couldn't win this war with brute force. The enemy had numbers, resources, and an entire galactic empire backing them. But what the Underdogs had was something far more dangerous. Desperation. Sergeant Mira Kane crouched beside a makeshift command console, a scavenged alien interface jury-rigged with human technology. She had spent years studying the Galactic Alliance, understanding the way they thought, the way they moved, the way they fought. And more importantly, she had learned how to make them doubt themselves. "They're adapting," she murmured, watching the enemy forces shift their formations. "They thought we'd be dead by now. They're not panicking yet, but they're second-guessing. We need to hit them again before they get comfortable." Elias nodded. "Suggestions?" Mira's eyes gleamed with something dangerous. "They're still thinking in terms of a traditional battlefield. They see us as a weakened army, trying to hold territory. But we're not an army." She looked at the ragtag group of fighters behind them. Scavengers, hackers, brawlers, ex-soldiers who had never fought together before this moment. "We're insurgents. We fight like ghosts." Rourke, the ex-smuggler turned weapons expert, grinned. "Good, because I just rigged half this field with enough explosives to make a sun blush." Dax, the cybernetically enhanced warrior, cracked his knuckles, his mechanical arm whirring softly. "Let's give them a reason to be afraid of the dark." The plan was simple. The enemy still thought they were dealing with soldiers who would engage in head-on combat. So the Underdogs did the opposite. They disappeared into the wreckage, into the tunnels beneath the battlefield, into the shadows. The next wave of the Galactic Alliance's finest advanced carefully, expecting resistance, but all they found was silence. And then the world erupted in fire. Explosions ripped through their ranks, collapsing structures, sending elite warriors scattering in chaos. And in that moment of confusion, the humans struck. Mira had studied their armor, their weapons, their communications. She knew exactly when their visors would be blinded by light, when their shields would drop for a fraction of a second after an impact, when their formations were weakest. And one by one, the elites fell. For the first time, the Galactic Alliance's most powerful warriors weren't just losing. They were afraid. The Underdogs weren't fighting to win a war. They were fighting because they had nothing else left. And an enemy with nothing to lose was an enemy the galaxy had never learned how to defeat. You said, the Galactic Alliance had never known fear. They were the rulers of the stars, the conquerors of countless worlds, the undisputed masters of warfare. Their elites had never faced an enemy they couldn't crush. Until now. The moon that was supposed to be humanity's graveyard had become something else. A nightmare, a hunting ground where the predators had become the prey. The Underdogs, the forgotten soldiers, the so-called failures of humanity had done what no one thought possible. They had survived. They had fought. And now, they had made the enemy bleed. Captain Elias Vance stood atop a ruined war machine, scanning the battlefield through his rifle's scope. Smoke and fire choked the air, and in the distance, the elite forces of the Galactic Alliance were regrouping. Their golden armor, once symbols of invincibility, was now cracked and scorched. Their perfect formations had become disorganized clusters. Their confidence was gone. Sergeant Mira Kane knelt beside him, running calculations on a scavenged datapad. "They're still trying to understand what's happening," she muttered. "They don't get it yet. They still think they can win if they just reorganize." Elias adjusted his scope, watching their enemy shift. "Then let's show them they're wrong." The plan had been simple: turn the battlefield into a maze of death, force the enemy into fights they didn't expect, hit them from angles they couldn't defend against. But now, they had an even greater advantage. The Alliance was hesitating. Rourke, the ex-smuggler and weapons expert, jogged up to them with a grin. "Good news, we just cracked one of their command frequencies. Bad news, they're calling in reinforcements." Mira frowned. "How many?" Rourke's grin faded. "A lot." Elias exhaled, his mind racing. This had been inevitable. The Alliance had underestimated them once, but they wouldn't make the same mistake again. If they sent their full force, there was no way the Underdogs could hold this ground. "Unless we don't hold," Elias said suddenly. "We take the fight to them." Mira blinked. "Are you serious?" "They expect us to keep defending," Elias explained. "They think we're desperate, that we're just trying to survive. So we do the opposite. We hit them first. We don't give them time to bring in reinforcements." Dax, the cybernetic warrior, stepped forward, his metal-enhanced arms glinting in the firelight. "You mean attack them directly?" "The elites? With what?" Rourke smirked. "Oh, I have a few ideas." The moon was a graveyard of old war machines, abandoned tanks, broken ships, half-functioning mechs, and Rourke had spent years making things that shouldn't work into weapons of destruction. Within hours, the Underdogs had repurposed the wreckage into a fleet of improvised war machines. Rusted but functional tanks rolled out of the scrapyard. Mechs, barely held together with welding and stolen parts, stomped into position. Energy cannons, salvaged from downed ships, were mounted onto platforms. The Alliance wasn't ready. When the Underdogs attacked, they did it like no human army ever had before. The elites expected precision, structured tactics. What they got was chaos. Mira led a strike team that infiltrated their communication hub, jamming their transmissions and turning their own technology against them. Elias spearheaded the charge, riding a repurposed hovercraft straight into the enemy lines, using their own discarded weapons to tear through them. Dax and his fighters engaged in brutal close combat, striking with the kind of desperation that only the forgotten could summon. The battlefield became a slaughter. The elites tried to fight back, but they had never fought an enemy like this, one that refused to break, refused to play by the rules. For the first time in history, the Galactic Alliance wasn't winning. They were losing. And worse, they knew it. Panic was setting in. The Galactic Alliance had come to this barren moon expecting a final, easy victory. Instead, they were being torn apart. Their finest warriors, the elites, the conquerors of countless worlds, were fighting an enemy that refused to die, refused to break, and refused to fight the way they were supposed to. Captain Elias Vance watched through his rifle's scope as the enemy lines crumbled. Their once perfect formations had fractured into scattered groups, their golden armor stained with dirt and blood. Fear was evident in the way they moved, in the hesitation before each order, in the way their eyes darted nervously into the shadows. Sergeant Mira Kane crouched beside him, scanning intercepted enemy transmissions. Her fingers danced across a makeshift console, hijacked from an alien command unit. "They're losing confidence," she murmured. "They still outnumber us, still have better tech, but they don't trust their leadership anymore. They don't know why they're losing." Rourke, the ex-smuggler and weapons engineer, chuckled as he checked the readouts on a scavenged plasma cannon. "That's because they've never fought people like us. They've crushed armies before, but we're not an army." He gestured at the ragtag group behind them. Cyborg mercenaries, outlawed hackers, disgraced soldiers, and criminals who had nothing left to lose. "We're a problem they don't know how to solve." Elias nodded, And we're going to make sure they never figure it out. The underdogs didn't fight for territory. They didn't hold the line or defend strongholds. They struck like phantoms, appearing where they weren't expected, vanishing before the enemy could mount a counterattack. Every night, they raided supply lines, stole weapons, hacked enemy systems. And every day, the elites woke up to find that they had lost even more ground. The Galactic Alliance's commanders tried to regain control, sending urgent orders to regroup, to reinforce their shattered lines. But Mira had already cracked their codes. By the time their orders reached the battlefield, they had been altered, twisted to send forces in the wrong direction, or delay reinforcements, just long enough for the underdogs to strike again. Dax, the cybernetic warrior, led brutal ambushes, taking down entire squads before they even realized they were under attack. Rourke's makeshift war machines, built from scrap and stolen tech, continued to wreak havoc. And Elias led from the front, always striking where the enemy was weakest, never giving them a moment to recover. Then came the moment that changed everything. A desperate distress signal. Mira intercepted it first. "They're calling for immediate extraction," she whispered, eyes wide with disbelief. "The elites, they want to retreat." Elias felt the weight of those words. Retreat. The Galactic Alliance had never retreated before. Their elites had never known defeat. But now, they were asking to be pulled out. Rourke let out a slow whistle. So much for their unstoppable warriors. Mira frowned, reading further into the intercepted data. Wait, no. The higher-ups denied their request. She turned to Elias. "They're not sending reinforcements. They're ordering the elites to finish this fight, no matter what." Dax cracked his knuckles. Sounds like they'd just signed their own death warrant. Elias exhaled. He had seen desperation before, and he knew what came next. The elites would fight harder than ever. Not because they wanted to win, but because they had no other choice. "This isn't over," he said. Not yet. The underdogs had already done the impossible. They had shattered the myth of the Galactic Alliance's invincibility. But now, they would have to do something even harder. They would have to finish what they started. The battlefield had changed. No longer was it a one-sided war where the Galactic Alliance's elites marched forward with arrogance, expecting an easy victory. Now, it was something else. A desperate, brutal struggle where the so-called underdogs had not just survived, but turned into something far more dangerous. Predators. Captain Elias Vance crouched behind the wreckage of a fallen alien walker, rifle pressed against his shoulder. Through his scope, he saw the panic in the enemy's ranks. The once mighty elites were no longer an organized, unstoppable force. Their golden armor was scorched and dented, their movements hesitant, their eyes scanning the battlefield not for a fight, but for a way out. But there was no escape. "They know they're doomed," Sergeant Mira Kane murmured beside him. She had her stolen data pad wired into the remains of an enemy communication node, feeding them real-time updates on the enemy's desperate transmissions. "They keep asking for reinforcements, but the higher-ups won't send any." Rourke, the ever-grinning weapons expert, snorted. "Cold bastards, sacrificing their own best soldiers just to save face." He tapped the side of his plasma cannon, a piece of alien tech he had modified to fire twice as hard and twice as fast. "Well, if they won't take their people back, we'll be happy to send them home in pieces." Dax, the cybernetic warrior, flexed his metal-enhanced fingers. "So, what's the move, Captain?" Elias considered the battlefield. They had done the impossible. They had made the elites afraid. But fear could make an enemy unpredictable. And cornered enemies didn't just run. Sometimes, they lashed out. "We push," Elias decided. "We don't give them time to regroup. We keep them off balance until they break completely." Mira smirked. "I like the sound of that." The underdogs moved fast. They had no heavy artillery, no reinforcements, no high-tech battle plans. But they had something far deadlier. They had adaptability. Instead of attacking in formation, they struck from the shadows, appearing where they weren't expected. Instead of meeting the enemy head-on, they lured them into traps, using the wreckage of past battles to their advantage. Mira and her tech team jammed enemy communications, feeding false orders to keep their ranks disoriented. Rourke and his scavengers rigged explosive traps in key choke points, turning narrow passageways into kill zones. Dax led hit-and-run skirmishes, smashing through enemy ranks before vanishing into the ruins. And Elias was always where the enemy least wanted him to be, right in the heart of the fight. The Galactic Alliance's finest warriors had been trained for open war, for organized combat, for battlefields where their superior technology and tactics would always grant them victory. But this wasn't that kind of war anymore. It was a war of survival. A war where the elite were hunted like prey by the very people they had once dismissed as weak, unworthy, insignificant. And then it happened. The first full-scale retreat. Mira caught it in the intercepted transmissions before the soldiers even acted. "They're abandoning their command center," she reported, disbelief in her voice. "They're pulling back. We broke them." Elias nodded grimly. "Then we make sure they don't come back." The Underdogs surged forward. What had started as a desperate struggle had become a full-blown rout. The elites tried to hold their ground, but their discipline had shattered. Some fought back in a panic. Others simply ran. And in the end, when the dust settled, there was only one truth left standing on that ruined battlefield. The Galactic Alliance's best had been defeated, not by an army, not by superior technology, but by the very people they had underestimated. The forgotten, the discarded, the underdogs. The battlefield was silent, not with peace, but with the eerie stillness that came after absolute destruction. Smoke curled from wreckage. The golden armor of the Galactic Alliance's elite warriors lay shattered, their once mighty war machines nothing more than burning husks. The Underdogs had done it. Captain Elias Vance stood amidst the ruins, gripping his rifle as he surveyed the aftermath. Bodies of fallen elites were scattered across the ground, their once pristine formations turned into corpses and debris. What was left of their forces had fled, abandoning their dead, their weapons, their pride. Sergeant Mira Kane walked up beside him, holding a stolen enemy datapad. "I'm still picking up distress signals. A few squads are trying to regroup, but," she smirked, shaking her head, "they're done. They just don't know it yet." Elias exhaled slowly. Victory. It should have felt like a moment to celebrate, but there was no cheering, no applause, just the quiet realization of what they had accomplished. They hadn't just survived. They had changed the balance of power. Rourke emerged from the wreckage, carrying an armful of salvaged weapons. "Well," he said, grinning, "I think it's safe to say we've officially ruined someone's day." Dax, his cybernetic enhancements still sparking from battle, crossed his arms. "They'll come back." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "The Alliance doesn't tolerate failure. They'll send someone worse next time." Elias nodded. "I know." The Galactic Alliance had never suffered a defeat like this before. They had never lost to an enemy so small, so insignificant in their eyes. And now, the entire galaxy would hear about it. Mira tapped her screen. Intercepted a new transmission. "High Command is furious. They're blaming the elites for being incompetent." She chuckled. "Typical. They can't admit that we actually beat them." Rourke slung a plasma rifle over his shoulder. "So what now? We just wait for the next wave." Elias shook his head. "No, we don't wait. We make sure they never forget what happened here." He turned to the Ragdig survivors, the underdogs who had fought against impossible odds and won. Their faces were worn, their bodies bruised and battered, but their spirits were unbroken. "We were supposed to be nothing," Elias said, his voice carrying across the battlefield. "Exiles. Rejects. Failures. They thought they could erase us, that we wouldn't matter." He gestured toward the ruins of the once mighty enemy forces. "But we proved them wrong. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. We didn't just survive, Elias continued. We showed them that no army, no empire, no so-called elite force is invincible. We made them afraid. And now, we have a choice. He let the silence hang, watching as his people, those who had been discarded, abandoned, and underestimated, stood taller than they ever had before. We can disappear into the shadows and wait for them to strike again. Elias's gaze swept over the crowd. Or we can take this fight to them. A hush fell over the group. Then Dax stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. I vote we make their lives hell. Rourke grinned. Now that's the kind of plan I can get behind. Mira smirked. You know me. I'm always up for ruining the Alliance's day. One by one, the underdogs nodded, determination burning in their eyes. They had been the least expected to win. And now, they were just getting started. You said, the Galactic Alliance was in chaos. The defeat of their elite warriors had sent shockwaves across the stars. The very idea that a group of rejects, criminals, and outcasts had destroyed their best forces was unthinkable, unacceptable. And yet, it had happened. Captain Elias Vance stood aboard the Shadowfall, an old smuggler ship turned warship, watching the intercepted transmissions flood in. Every powerful faction in the galaxy was reacting, some with fear, some with rage, and some with a cautious curiosity. We're a problem now, Mira said, scrolling through enemy reports. High Command is scrambling. They don't know whether to cover this up or use it as an excuse to launch a full-scale retaliation. Rourke leaned against a crate, cleaning a plasma rifle. Let them come. We've already beaten their best. Dax, arms crossed, shook his head. We caught them off guard before. Next time, they won't underestimate us. Elias knew they were right. Their victory had been historic, but it had also painted a massive target on their backs. The Alliance wouldn't allow this defeat to stand. They would send something worse, something designed to make an example out of them. We need to move before they do, Elias said. Mira raised an eyebrow. You thinking of running? Elias shook his head. I'm thinking of striking first. Silence filled the room. Then Rourke let out a slow grin. Now you're speaking my language. Mira tilted her head, intrigued. You have something in mind. Elias turned to the holographic map, zooming in on a system just outside enemy-controlled space. The Valis Station. It's where the Alliance sends their battle plans, reinforcement requests, and war updates. If we hit them there, we don't just slow them down, we put them in the dark. Dax nodded. Without orders, their forces will be stranded, isolated. Rourke's grin widened. And confused soldiers make easy targets. Elias looked at them all, his ragtag crew of underdogs who had somehow turned into the galaxy's most dangerous resistance force. They called us nothing, he said. They thought we didn't matter. Mira smirked. Guess it's time to remind them why that was a mistake. The Shadowfall powered up, engines roaring to life. The underdogs had won a battle. Now, they were going to start a war. You said. The Shadowfall dropped out of hyperspace, a ghost in the void. Valis Station loomed ahead, a massive Galactic Alliance command hub, its surface bristling with defense turrets and patrol ships. This was where the Alliance coordinated its war efforts, sending orders to fleets across the stars. Taking it down wouldn't just hurt them, it would cripple them. Inside the ship, the underdogs prepared for battle. Elias Vance stood in the center of the war room, eyes fixed on the holographic display of the station. We hit them fast, disable their command systems, and vanish before reinforcements arrive. Mira Kane tapped her wrist device, her expression focused. Jamming protocols ready. Once we're in, I can cut their communications. Rourke checked his heavy plasma cannon. I'll handle the explosions. Dax flexed his cybernetic fingers. And I'll make sure no one gets in our way. Elias looked around the room. These weren't just fighters. They were survivors. And now, they were about to do the impossible, again. "Let's remind them why they fear us," he said. The attack was brutal. The Shadowfall slipped past the outer defenses, using stolen Alliance codes to bypass initial scans. By the time the alarms blared, Elias and his team were already inside. Mira hacked into the station's systems, shutting down internal security. Work planted charges at key support structures. Dax led the assault team, cutting down elite guards with ruthless efficiency. Elias moved through the chaos, taking down officers before they could send distress signals. The station trembled under the onslaught. Panic spread through the enemy ranks. Soldiers, once proud warriors of the Galactic Alliance, fled in terror, realizing too late that they weren't dealing with mere rebels. They were facing something worse, something unstoppable. By the time the Underdogs extracted, the station was collapsing. Explosions ripped through its core, sending fire and debris into space. The Alliance's war machine had been blinded. As the Shadowfall jumped into hyperspace, Elias watched the destruction fade into the distance. They had been the least expected to win. Now, they weren't just survivors. They were legend.